Imagine for a second a massive, impenetrable bank vault, like it's buried deep underground and it's just filled with your country's most valuable natural resources.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. Now, imagine finding out that between 2021 and 2025, an astonishing $170 billion worth of liquid natural gas, or LNG, was just hauled out of that vault and exported overseas.
Which is an unimaginable amount of money, honestly.
It's enough wealth to permanently reshape a nation. But here is the mind-boggling paradox. The companies pulling that gas out of the ground paid exactly $0 in federal royalties on 56% of those exports. Literally zero.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a massive accounting error, right? Or
Yeah.
maybe some kind of typo in a national ledger. But it is entirely real. And perhaps more shockingly, it's entirely legal.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're opening up this massive stack of internal government reports and Senate hearing transcripts from April 2026 to figure out, who left the door to Australia's natural gas vault wide open.
Wide open and unguarded.
Exactly. Our mission today is to uncover how a global resource superpower like a country practically swimming in LNG is suffering from a classic resource curse. We're going to look at why Australia lacks a permanent sovereign wealth fund, dig into the hidden mechanisms allowing these massive companies to legally avoid taxes, and examine the intense political fight over whether to just slap a radical 25% gas export tax on them without completely freezing global investment.
Right, because by 2026, the country has really reached a breaking point.
Yeah.
Doing nothing is mathematically unsustainable. But as we'll see in these Senate notes, rushing a massive new tax policy is incredibly dangerous for the broader economy. It's a fascinating case study in just the sheer difficulty of undoing decades of established fiscal policy.
Okay, let's unpack this. The core mystery here is just staggering. You have a nation so rich in gas, yet domestic energy prices for everyday people are skyrocketing, and there are basically zero long-term national savings to show for it.
Yeah.
So, to understand how we arrived at this exact point, we have to look at the gold standard of resource management. If we want to see what long-term wealth preservation actually looks like, we have to talk about Norway.
Oh, absolutely. Norway is the benchmark.
Right, because both Norway and Australia have massive offshore reserves, but they took two completely divergent paths.
Completely divergent. I mean, Norway's system operates on what we can basically call an iron triangle of policy. First, they impose a staggering 78% effective tax rate on oil and gas profits.
Wow, 78%.
Yeah, it's huge. And second, they maintain incredibly strict limits on what companies can actually claim as tax deductions.
Yeah.
And third, they take that massive influx of government revenue and they funnel it directly into a sovereign wealth fund.
And the underlying philosophy there is like resource monetization, leading to capital appreciation, resulting in generational sharing. They are capturing anywhere from 50 to 80% of the resource rent, which is the excess profit from the natural resources, and they just save it.
They save it, and crucially, they invest it globally. They don't spend it on today's domestic budget.
Wait, why not spend it at home? Wouldn't that help the citizens right now?
Well, because pumping that much raw cash into a relatively small economy would cause massive inflation. So instead, they buy international stocks and real estate. The dividends benefit the country for centuries without overheating their own local economy today.
That's brilliant. So they treat the oil and gas as a national inheritance. You never spend the principal, you just live off the interest.
Nicely.
But Australia chose a very different model. It's fundamentally a, dig it up, pay low tax, and spend it short-term philosophy. We heavily favored handing the resources over to private and foreign companies with incredibly generous terms.
We did. But, to be fair to the policymakers of the time, we really have to understand why Australia chose that path. Back in the 1990s and early 2000s, developing Australia's offshore gas fields was an immense technological and financial gamble.
Right, they weren't exactly easy to get to.
Not at all. These fields, particularly off the Northwest Shelf, are incredibly remote. Operating deep underwater, hundreds of kilometers from shore, it required multi-billion-dollar investments before a single drop of gas was ever produced.
So the government was essentially desperate for foreign capital and expertise to even get started. They offered a sweetheart deal to de-risk the investment. They basically said, hey, if you build these massive offshore platforms, we won't tax you heavily until you've paid off your massive debts.
Exactly. It was a strategy to attract global capital. But the long-term result is that the resource dividend, that massive wave of wealth generated when global gas prices eventually spiked, it isn't being stored for the nation's future, it's being eaten
Eaten.
Yeah, eaten by foreign shareholders in the form of corporate profits and eaten by the current generation through short-term government spending.
So, if I'm understanding this, instead of putting the money into a high-yield savings account for our kids like Norway did, we effectively let someone else harvest our gardens, sell the produce overseas, and now we're stuck buying back our own leftovers at a massive markup.
That analogy perfectly captures the domestic fallout. And the notes really highlight this massive East Coast gas crisis. You've got these international consortiums, massive players like Shell and Chevron, and their entire multi-billion-dollar business model is built on what are called take-or-pay export contracts.
Yeah, I saw those contracts mentioned heavily in the transcripts. How do they actually work in practice?
Well, a take-or-pay contract is a legally binding long-term international agreement. It means a buyer in, say, Japan or South Korea agrees to take a set volume of gas every year or pay for it anyway.
Okay.
And the producer's legally obligated to deliver it. They can't just tear up those contracts and divert the gas to Sydney or Melbourne just because there's a local shortage.
Hmm.
Breaking those contracts would trigger massive international lawsuits.
So they're legally locked into sending the vast majority of this gas straight to Asia, which leaves the domestic market in Australia completely scrambling.
Right. What's left over is just residual supply. And because there historically wasn't a strict domestic reservation policy on the East Coast, unlike in Western Australia, which actually mandates saving gas for local use, the local East Coast market has to compete on the global stage for its own gas.
Oh, that sounds disastrous.
It is. When global prices spike, say due to wars or international supply shocks, domestic Australian wholesale prices spike right alongside them. We're talking about a 73% jump in wholesale prices.
Which is the textbook definition of the resource curse. Like, you live on top of the gas, but your local manufacturing gets hollowed out because they can't afford the energy to run their factories. And you, the everyday citizen, see your cost of living absolutely explode.
Exactly.
Your electricity bill is pegged to international crisis prices, even though the gas is coming from literally your own backyard.
It's a profound structural imbalance. But it brings up the trillion-dollar question. If Australia does have tax laws on the books, how are these massive companies exporting billions of dollars of gas and legally paying zero federal resource taxes on more than half of it?
Right. Like, if the garden is being harvested to the tune of $170 billion, why isn't the tax collector at the gate taking a cut?
The answer lies in a relic of a bygone era called the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax, or PRRT. This federal tax mechanism was designed decades ago for the old oil era.
Okay, so it wasn't made for gas.
Exactly. Oil projects generally have shorter construction cycles and historically operated in high-price environments. You drill a hole, oil comes out, you sell it, you pay the tax. But modern LNG megaprojects are a completely different beast.
Because of the massive upfront capital required, right? Like you mentioned the offshore platforms, but they also have to build hundreds of kilometers of underwater pipelines and then these gigantic onshore liquefaction plants that actually freeze the gas into a liquid so it can be put on a ship.
Precisely. They take years to build and have lifespans of several decades. The PRRT was simply never designed to handle that sheer scale of upfront cost or the long delay before profitability. And this structural mismatch created two massive legal loopholes.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is CapEx deductions and uplifts.
Break down how an uplift works, because from the outside, it just looks like magic accounting.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
Under the PRRT, companies are allowed to deduct their massive upfront construction costs, their capital expenditures, or CapEx, against their profits before they pay any tax. But to compensate the companies for the financial risk of building these mega projects, the government doesn't just allow a one-to-one deduction, they allow an uplift.
And what exactly is that?
An uplift is essentially a generous interest rate applied to those unrecovered costs by the government.
Wait, what? So if a company spends $10 billion building a facility, they don't just get to deduct $10 billion from their future taxes. The government adds an interest rate on top of that credit every single year they aren't making a profit.
Yes, exactly. And because LNG projects are notoriously over budget and take years, sometimes a decade, to become profitable, these uplifts compound year after year.
Oh my God.
Yeah. By the time the gas is finally flowing and the project is making money, the accumulated paper deductions are so massive that they completely consume all the taxable profit. On paper, the project isn't making a super profit, so the PRRT isn't triggered at all.
That is wild. It's like having a credit card where the bank pays you compounding interest on your debt. So by the time you actually have money, your credits are so high, you never actually have to pay your bill.
That is exactly how it functions in practice. But the second loophole is even more complex. It's called gas transfer pricing, or GTP.
Okay, how does GCP work?
Well, when an oil company pumps oil, there's a clear, transparent global market price for a barrel of crude right there at the wellhead. But LNG is part of an integrated, invisible supply chain. The gas is extracted offshore, piped to an onshore facility, turned into liquid, and then sold. The PRRT is supposed to be levied on the value of the raw gas at the point of extraction, not the final sale price of the frozen liquid in Asia.
Right, so the companies have to calculate a transfer price between their own offshore extraction division and their onshore liquefaction division. It's essentially an internal sale to themselves.
Yes. But how do you objectively price raw gas inside a pipe when there is no open market for it?
I'm guessing you use a formula that favors the company.
Exactly. You rely on complex internal formulas. And the Treasury has repeatedly found that the current GTP system systematically undervalues the gas at that transfer point.
Meaning they deliberately assign a low value to the raw gas being extracted, which minimizes the federal tax, and shift all the profit margin down the supply chain to the liquefaction stage, which isn't subject to the PRRT at all.
You've got it.
So the profits just legally escape the resource tax net.
They completely escape. And the disparity this creates is vast. Look at the capture rates from the reports. Australia captures less than 3% of the overall resource value.
3%, that's nothing.
To put that in perspective, Qatar exports a similar volume of gas to the global market. Qatar takes home about 56 billion Australian dollars in government revenue from that export. Australia captures only between 10.6 billion and 17 billion.
6 major companies exported $165 billion worth of gas over a decade, and some of them paid absolutely zero corporate tax in several of those years. You read those numbers and, your immediate reaction is to grab the pitchforks. It just feels like pure corporate greed.
It's the completely natural reaction to those figures, but the sources from the Senate hearings reveal a reality that is far more complex than just greedy foreign corporations. We really have to look at the counter-narrative here, because understanding their defense explains why simply hiking the tax rate overnight is incredibly dangerous for the economy.
Okay, let's hear the industry's defense. What do the energy giants, Woodside, Santos, Chevron actually say when they are confronted with these staggering numbers by the Senate in 2026?
Their core argument is that hyper-focusing exclusively on the PRRT is highly misleading. Australia operates a dual-track tax system. They argue that while the PRT revenue is low due to construction deductions, the oil and gas industry as a whole actually paid $21.9 billion in total taxes in the 2024 to 2025 financial year.
Wait, $21.9 billion. Where is that coming from?
That figure includes whatever PRRT was paid, standard corporate tax, and state royalties.
Hold on, let me push back on that. State royalties are applied to onshore projects and gas extracted within state waters, like in Queensland. We're talking about billions of dollars extracted from offshore federal waters. Why does paying a state tax in Queensland excuse them from their federal obligations offshore?
Well, that is exactly the friction point. The industry's point is about their overall tax burden across their entire Australian portfolio. In Queensland, companies pay a rigid 5 to 10% royalty directly on their revenue, not their profit. A revenue-based royalty means you pay the government a cut of every dollar that comes in the door, regardless of your deductions, even if the project is operating at a massive loss that year.
Oh, I see.
So the industry argues they are already carrying a heavy, inflexible tax burden onshore. If the federal government slaps a massive new export tax on top of their entire portfolio, it risks double taxation and could instantly turn viable projects into money losers.
Okay, I understand the portfolio argument, but there is a massive complication hidden in these documents regarding who actually owns these companies.
Yeah.
And this completely changes the narrative for me. You hear names like Chevron or ConocoPhillips, and you just think of massive foreign conglomerates.
Yeah, right.
But the ownership structure is deeply integrated into the local economy. Take Woodside, for example. It's an ASX-listed public company in Australia, and roughly 7.14% of it is owned by Australian Super, one of the country's largest pension funds.
Which means everyday Australians are the shareholders.
Right. If we slash these companies' profits with a massive new blunt tax, it's not just offshore billionaires losing out. Squeezing corporate profits might inject $17 billion into the national budget today to help with the cost of living, but it directly shrinks the retirement funds of millions of everyday citizens tomorrow.
Exactly.
We are essentially taxing our own superannuation.
This is the absolute crux of the debate. How do you balance the desperate need to fund current government services against the need to protect the long-term investments that secure your population's retirement? This exact tension is what culminated in the explosive April 2026 Senate hearings.
The public pressure at those hearings was immense. I mean, you had the Greens, various economic think tanks, and even a former treasurer pushing for a radical solution to bypass all the loopholes. A flat 25% gas export tax, no complex deductions, no uplifts, no transfer pricing internal accounting, just 25% off the top of the export value.
It is the ultimate blunt instrument. And the appeal is completely understandable. It would instantly raise about $17 billion a year. That's capital that could immediately go toward paying down national debt, funding free health care, or subsidizing your domestic energy bills. Public support for this proposal was sitting at a massive 87%.
But Prime Minister Albanese reportedly blocked this comprehensive new tax ahead of the May budget. He said no to a policy with 87% public support. I mean, that seems like political suicide. Why block it?
Because of the severe macroeconomic risks of shifting abruptly from a low tax to a high tax model, it comes down to something called sovereign risk. The energy producers warned the Senate that this blunt levy was, quote, spectacular ill-advised.
Sovereign risk is one of those terms economists love to throw around. What does it actually mean in this context?
Sovereign risk refers to the danger that a government will change the rules of the game after the investments have already been made. LNG requires decades of certainty. These companies invested billions of dollars under one specific set of tax rules. If a government suddenly imposes a massive 25% revenue tax on sunk costs, it breaks a fundamental promise of fiscal stability.
And if you break that promise, you trigger investment chill. Like, if the current tax system is a leaky bucket, a blunt 25% tax isn't a targeted patch. It's like freezing all the water in the bucket to stop the drip. Sure, the leaking stops, but now you can't drink the water. The capital just freezes completely.
That is exactly what happens. The global capital will simply flow to Qatar or the United States instead, where the tax regimes are considered more stable. For Australia, that means new domestic projects like the massive Scarborough gas field could be frozen or abandoned entirely. Yeah, and the dynamic economic models show that if you freeze investment today, by 2030, you aren't just losing future tax revenue. You are facing severe physical domestic gas shortages. You literally won't have enough energy to keep the local grids running.
Okay, so we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. We have a blunt 25% tax, which freezes the entire industry. But we also know the current system is a failed design that is practically giving away a national asset for free. How do we actually transition to a system that captures fair value without causing massive capital flight?
The sources outline a very clear, practical consensus for what they call smart design reform. It's a step-by-step framework to transition the economy safely.
Okay, so if the core problem with the PRT is that companies can invent an internal price for their gas to avoid taxes, how do we force a real price?
You fix the pricing mechanism by moving to a netback method.
A netback method.
Yeah. Instead of letting the companies calculate a transfer price based on obscure internal metrics, you take the final transparent sale price of the LNG in Asia and you work backwards. You subtract the objective, verifiable costs of shipping and liquefaction to determine the true value of the raw gas at the wellhead. It completely stops the profit from escaping down the supply chain.
Oh, that makes sense. That closes the transfer pricing loophole. But fixing the price doesn't stop them from claiming those massive historical construction debts we talked about earlier. How do you close the uplift loophole where they just compound their deductions forever?
You cap the deductions. You place a hard statutory limit on how much of their tax bill they can offset with those historical uplifts in any given year. For example, limiting deductions to 90% of their assessable receipts.
Oh, so they can't wipe out the whole bill.
Exactly. Even if they have billions in accumulated paper losses, they still have to pay something into the public purse right now, ensuring revenue flows back to the public sooner rather than decades later.
Okay, and what about the offshore fields that are currently paying absolutely zero royalties? The ones outside state jurisdiction?
You gradually introduce a supplementary federal revenue-based royalty for those offshore fields. You mimic the successful model they already use onshore in Queensland. It ensures a baseline level of return for the resource, regardless of the project's complex profit deductions.
But how do you implement all of these new rules, netback pricing, deduction caps, federal royalties, without triggering the sovereign risk we just talked about? If you change the rules on sunk costs, they will sue you.
You have to utilize grandfathering. You simply cannot change the rules on Billions of dollars of sunk investments overnight without triggering years of legal warfare and destroying your national credit rating.
Right.
So you apply the strict new rules to all new projects, and you phase them in gradually for the existing ones over a period of 5 to 10 years.
It's about building a sustainable, long-term framework. If you do this right, you slowly transition away from the short-term spend cycle. You start capturing the resource rent efficiently, and you finally build the capital foundation to create a permanent national fund, just like Norway did, without scaring off the investors you need to actually pull the gas out of the ground.
Exactly. But there is one final piece of the puzzle. Because none of that long-term fiscal policy solves the immediate problem of a family on the East Coast whose power bill just doubled this month. To help you right now, as someone paying those skyrocketing energy bills, the framework includes strict domestic reservation.
Oh, meaning they have to keep some gas here.
Yes, the government mandates that 15 to 25% of all East Coast gas must be reserved exclusively for the domestic market.
Which bypasses those international take-or-pay contracts. It floods the local grid with supply, breaks the reliance on expensive residual gas, and immediately cools down the local cost of living. This is a policy that is already pushing forward for 2027.
It is a really delicate balancing act. Doing nothing is completely unsustainable and deeply irresponsible to future generations who will inherit the national debt, but none of the actual physical gas.
Right.
But swinging wildly to a blunt overnight tax could jeopardize not just energy security, but the very pension funds that everyday citizens rely on. The transition to this smart, loophole-free framework takes time, and it takes immense political discipline.
Discipline to stop treating our natural resources like a quick ATM withdrawal and start treating them like an inheritance. We've spent this entire deep dive talking about how governments and corporations divide up the pie, the mechanisms, the compounding uplifts, the political showdown.
Lots of moving parts.
Yeah. But when you step back from all the spreadsheets and the tax codes, you have to ask yourself a fundamental question. Who truly owns the natural resources buried under a country's soil? If the answer is a people, then you have to wonder, at what point does failing to build a long-term sovereign wealth fund stop being just bad policy and start becoming the greatest theft in modern history? Imagine that vault full of wealth again. Only this time, you know exactly who left the back door wide open.